everyone, and welcome. I'm Barbara Tien here at Project Kin, and welcome to a very special event with Lisa Maguire talking to us about microhistory. Lisa was one of the very first followers I had here at Project Kin, and I've always been very grateful. Over time, I got to know that the depth of her posts and the thoughtfulness of her feedback and comments was coming from the fact that she's a real historian and a real academic professional historian. So as I dove back into this, it gave me new insight into the kinds of work that she's been doing on the Maguires of Quebec City and the Beaubassin series. That is really a must read for everyone here interested in family storytelling and, as we will learn, microhistory. So I've invited Lisa to join us and share with us a little bit of that perspective. We'll have a little time at the end for discussion.
While we're waiting for Barbara to rejoin, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lisa Maguire, and I'm a writer on Substack, and I work mainly on stories about my family, my Irish Canadian family and my French Canadian family. And one of the things that I really love about Substack is that you can experiment with different types of writing. And I've been experimenting with different kinds of storytelling about my family. So some of my pieces are more, direct memoir, stories my mother told me. Some of them are creative nonfiction, like the series about Beaubassin, where I invent conversations and, sort of fill in the gaps in the history. And some of the pieces I've been trying to really write mostly about is grounding my family in history and seeing them as historical people, historical actors. So some of the pieces that I've written mainly about my Maguire family in Montreal was really around, oh, Barbara's back, is really about how to think about them as historical actors, as people who are not just my family, but people who can tell us something about the broader history of Montreal, of the Irish in Canada, of urban history. So I don't know if I want to pass it back to Barbara for now. I have somebody else on the window as well.
That's
Barbara,
totally
are you there?
fine.
There you are. Okay.
Yes, I am. Apologies. It turns out I'm glad I made you a co-host and I had a little power hit or something. It just took everything down and poof, back up again. So this all will be deleted from the official record, and please pick it on up again. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I just introduced myself. I don't know if you were on there for that part of the conversation. But what we were going to talk about today was microhistory, and I put together a couple of pages. I don't know if you want me to put them up on the screen, Barbara. That would be helpful. So microhistory is a genre of history writing, of academic history writing, which became popular in the 1970s, 1980s. It's not to say it didn't exist before that, but it was something that really was became much more popular, and as a tool to investigate primarily less well-known subject matters, peoples who had not been written about before, and for whom history had been erased. So the seminal work of microhistory was by a man named Carlo Ginzburg, who wrote a book called The Cheese and the Worms, which was about the heresy trial of a 16th century Italian miller. So an otherwise totally obscure person, but because Ginzburg had access to the trial records, he found this an incredibly rich terrain to be able to understand the history and mentalities of this new class of people who were getting access to books for the first time, and what their intellectual life was like, and how they thought about the world. And so it was really an opportunity to look at a text from a completely different perspective. So he wasn't the inquisitor trying to understand how this person became a heretic. Rather, he was trying to understand how this miller understood the world from the text that he had access to. And so from there, it became a very popular tool to use, as I said, for the history of marginalized peoples, for the histories of other kinds of histories that we hadn't thought about before. So the small subject is really where microhistory lives. So I have here, what is microhistory? It's a history that focuses on very small units of research. It could be a biography, it could be a place, it could be a community, it could be an event. But what it's not a case study, right? It's not something that focuses only on that subject. Rather, the subject is used as a way to think about the broader history. It's frequently something that is going to correct the broader narrative, something that we didn't know about before or something that we got wrong before. So it's genealogy and family history is not microhistory. It can be, but it's not necessarily microhistory, right? Because family history, sometimes we write family history and we put some context on it. But instead, we could write microhistory and say, not what did history wasn't something that happened to our family, but rather how did our family make history? How is our family our historical actors? So the difference really between family history and microhistory, or between microhistory and other kinds of single subject research, is the nature of the questions that we ask. So what do I mean by historical question? These are questions that drive the understanding of the broader world by studying that small subject. So that's typically meant in the context of family history. I think that's really around centering your family in the world to understand how they thought about the world, how they made sense of it, and what meanings did they derive from their daily life, from their work, from their communities, any of these things. And that's what is typically called history of mentalities, which is what Carlo Ginzburg was doing and what other microhistorians have done. So when we engage in microhistory, some of the questions we can ask is, really like, when we think about our family history, what did our ancestors create? How did they preserve their culture, or how did they transmit it? How did the world of work that they engaged in, how did that change the world? So I wrote a piece about my family in Quebec City, who were 3 generations of Irish stevedores, and I had no idea. These were completely ordinary people who had nothing interesting about them, really. I mean, there are no books written about them. There are no plaques, commemorating them. However, they were one of a handful of people that moved 90% of the North American timber out through Quebec City into and basically built the British Navy and built the British Empire. And that's kind of incredible to think about. But that's an example of where, a regular person's labor can actually be a transforming event. I mean, and an historical event. And how their way of life created our present environment is another good example. You think of our people who have Western settlers in their family tree, and how that completely changed the landscape. And then also how people in our family affected change, how they may have protested or resisted the dominant structure, or how they sometimes simply persisted or survived, the hierarchies and repressive societies. I'm thinking of some of the Australian, members of our community who write about these incredible transportation narratives that are framed in the legal regime that these people got sent away under, which is just incredible to me. And I think it really not just enriches the family history, but tells us something very profound about the history of England and Australia. So I think by applying the tools of microhistory and by asking those questions to our family history, we can really gain insights to larger history. So then I think the question that Barbara had asked last Sunday was like, well, how do we do it? Tell us how to do it. What's the checklist? So I wouldn't say there's a checklist, but there's a number of things we can think about. And as we start writing about our families. So I just put some ideas on a page and we can talk about them. But the first thing would be obviously to start with an artifact. So it could be something like a photograph. It could be, a document. It could be anything and then simply ask historical questions of it. In other words, think about it on its own terms, and not what you already know about it, but sort of think about it fresh for the first time. Another way to think about the documents that we do have, like my family is very ordinary. We have very little that's written about us. But sometimes you can pull together all these scattered fragments of what you do know and pull them together once you understand enough of the history around it and discover something and reconstruct some invisible history. So the example that I think I wrote about in my piece that I published last week was around my great-grandfather, who had been part of this Irish sort of community defense during the Orange crisis. And that started from just a couple of little newspaper articles that I found, or little newspaper ads, really, like an ad for a meeting, a community meeting. And from there, I found out other things that where he had worked as a printer and other things about the neighborhood. And I was able to pull these fragments together and write about something about this particular community history for the first time. I don't think anyone has really investigated this. People have written about the Orange crisis, but not from this perspective. So that's an example of where you can pull together the fragments that you do find about your family and write something original. So another sort of strategy is to explore the silences. So there's so much that's not written, especially if you come from a marginalized community. There's so much that's not told about your family and not written. And sometimes you have to fill the gap with oral history or other sources. But that's just the mere fact that something's missing is also extremely interesting and important. Right? Reading against the grain is another approach, and that's what Carlo Ginzburg did in The Cheese and the Worms. Right? These were, as I said, these were trial transcripts, and he wasn't reading them from the perspective of the inquisitor. Instead, he was reading them from the perspective of an historian who's trying to understand the mind of this person, and for a very different purpose. So there's all kinds of examples where you can do that. I think genealogists do that quite naturally. I mean, they pick up a document like a will or a census or something, and they're looking for other information. They're looking to read it for another purpose. They're not reading it for the legal reason. They're reading it to find out who inherited and who that person's relationship was to the person who left them the money. And that it's something that genealogists do completely naturally, and it's something that you can employ across other kinds of research as well. So investigating the everyday is something else that's really important for ordinary people who don't have histories written about them. So that could be, things that we normally don't think of as important because they have not been written about, and we just sort of take it for granted. I'm thinking, for example, of people's interest in recipes. Like, Lori has been writing a lot about in her culinary history Substack about family recipes. And that is such an incredibly rich terrain, not just because they preserve family history, but they preserve community history. And they also tell us things that we haven't really thought about enough, like, the role of, domestic politics or food politics or any of these other things. I know Lori wrote a piece about ration books. That was so interesting because I haven't really thought much about the history of rationing in the context of, how you actually create recipes. So there's all kinds of ways you can use the history of everyday life in your family and the objects and the artifacts that you have to build out a broader history about their experience. And finally, this is a quote from Amy Liu, and I just love it, is interrogate the weird. She got this from a writing teacher named Jim Shepard, who's a wonderful writer as well. If you've never read his short stories, I highly recommend. But he would always ask his writing students to interrogate the weird. I think that is such great advice because, there's so many things, like you read an old newspaper and there's things in there that are clearly hilarious to the people at the time, and we don't understand the humor. We don't get it, or we don't get the reference. We don't understand why they're upset about something or why they find something important. And that, to me, is the gold. Once you can really delve into this and really understand the context, you'll find something really original and new. So there's a really terrific book by Robert Darnton called The Great Cat Massacre. And it's a series of essays about 18th century France. And he takes the approach of an anthropologist to try to understand the experience of ordinary people in France and French people who seem very alien. Their mentalities seem very alien to us. And in the story about the cat massacre, it's about a group of artisans in Paris who go around putting the neighborhood cats on trial and killing them. And it's the most horrifying from our perspective, the most horrifying thing to do. Like absolutely gruesome. Like, who would ever do such a disgusting, sadistic thing? But for them, it was hilarious. And he spends the essay unpacking the humor of this to explain like what it is that they think they're doing and why, and what is the grievance that they are expressing and why they find what he just explains the joke. And by doing so, he really exposes the this history of this group of artisans and of working people in France at this period. So there's all kinds of ways where you can really try and figure out the joke or figure out the reference that doesn't make sense to you, and that's where the gold is, in my opinion. So then we say, like, well, how do I ask the larger questions? So we've talked a little bit about this already, but there's some examples of how you can use microhistory. So, for example, reconstructing, as I said, reconstructing the missing history of ordinary people is a good one. There's so much that has not been, stories that have not been told, history that have not been written. Using a case to challenge prevailing notions is another one. We have all kinds of received ideas about periods of history, and then a micro historian will come along and show you something that you didn't know. The best example I can think of, there's a book by the Origins of English Individualism, where this historian looks at the land. He looks at land transactions in early modern England. And in so doing, he completely explodes Marx and Weber simultaneously. I mean, it's unbelievable. He shows that the rise of English capitalism has everything to do with the fact there was already a cash market in land, and it had nothing to do with Weber's concept of the iron cage or Marx's notion of the enclosures. I mean, nothing. It's the most brilliant piece of writing, and it's based on very specific artifacts, right? Very specific subjects. So there's all kinds of places where we can do that in our family history, where we can write microhistory that really retells a story in a way that shares something that we didn't know, or as I said, reverses our received ideas about a topic or about a place or a community. And then the other notable example is places where you can see an individual, can express themselves in a way that was unexpected. So again, the case of the cheese and the worms. This was a very repressive society, and yet this Miller felt compelled to tell people his own theories about the humanity of non-Christians and the divinity of Jesus Christ and all these other things that eventually got him burnt to the stake. But the fact is, he felt empowered to do this through reading. Is such an extraordinary thing to discover through this microhistory. So I thought I'll just stop there. What I was going to do next was actually just talk about some of the people in our family history writing community and the kinds of microhistories, the different approaches they're taking, because I think I have learned so much from all of them, and I feel like we can all draw inspiration from all these different approaches that they've taken, which are all kind of flavors of microhistory. They're different kinds of ways of using the same kinds of tools to ask the bigger questions. Barbara, should I just pause there if people have questions before we delve in? Or
it's certainly reasonable to see if anybody has any other questions before we get started, but I think you can go ahead and keep going.
Okay. So there's a number of folks that I think that we probably a lot of us on this call know, and have probably read their writings, but if not, then it's a great opportunity to discover some new writers. The first one that comes to, and I'll try to group them according to some of these categories and these like approaches I've talked about already. So the first one is Dr. Mary Marshall, who I just think is such a wonderful example of microhistory. Not surprisingly, she can use these. Oh, sorry.
Do you want to take the slides down and show your
yeah,
browser?
let's do that. Sorry. Thank you.
There you go.
So it's not surprising that she uses the tools of microhistory so effectively. She is herself an academic, so she's probably very familiar with all the strategies of history writing. But she writes about her family, and in the context of history, and not all of them are microhistory. Sometimes they're more personal memoir, but there are a couple of pieces. There's one in particular that I really love, which was about her great grandmother, Mary Wright Williams, and it's called Owning Her Labor and Leisure Time, which was like the best title because what she tells us about her great grandmother, who was a laundress in Georgia in the 1890s, and then into the 20th century. She manages to completely upend my preconceived notions about what a Black woman who was a laundress in Georgia in that period would be, what her life would be like. I would associate, like, just because I hate doing laundry, I think, oh, being a laundress, that must be the most horrible menial job. That must be just terrible. And in fact, this was as the title suggests, it gave her great grandmother a tremendous amount of independence. She didn't work for other people. She worked for herself. And she had independence. She was able to raise her family. She was able to buy investment properties with her husband. And she was able to reclaim her own time. She did this on her own time. I mean, it's just wonderful. And it just completely, as I said, rearranges your thoughts around a topic that you just, you go into it having certain preconceived notions about this person. And she does that several times. And so I learned so much from her for that reason. Another example I thought was, the next two examples are really using local history as microhistory, which I thought were really, really terrific. The first one is David Shaw. So David Shaw writes about his ongoing project of preserving Union Cemetery in Randolph County, Illinois. And was trained as an archaeologist. And so he brings all that knowledge of archaeology to his study of the graveyard as they are in the process of restoring it. And he brings in a lot of other tools of various academic disciplines as well. The piece that I thought really was such a knockout was one that he wrote not about the cemetery, but about a town in Randolph County, which was the place where there was an abolitionist society before the Civil War. And in so doing, he really is able to explain to us so much about the local history of the abolitionist movement. And what's particularly interesting is how this was a pro-slavery county. So it's really he really lays out the politics of the pro-slavery and the abolitionist movements in this small place, which also was the hub of the Underground Railroad. It's, I mean, the most incredible history. So I thought that was a knockout. I thought that was it does a number of things, right? It explores the silence, right? This is not something that we commonly know a lot about because it's local history. And it also reads against the grain because he's looking at this material in a way that we haven't really considered before. The larger context of all of these small anti-slavery societies. And it's also looking at these little scattered traces. Like he's pulling together in this series. He's pulling together the traces, the archaeological traces of the Underground Railroad, plus the written record of this slavery society. I mean, it's just brilliant stuff. Jill Swenson writes about in her piece, in her Substack, Memory, Time, and History in the Lake of the Woods. She's writing about an Ojibwe community that lived on Lake of the Woods. And these are wonderful pieces just because even though it's not her family, she's writing about a family and a community. And she's writing about the more recent history of the Ojibwe people living in this place. And what's interesting to me is in the series about the entirely legal expropriation of their land. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. She goes and explains how this happened and the process steps of how they lost title to their land. And it was just so wonderfully done. And it gave me so much to think about in terms of how Indigenous peoples everywhere lose title to their land in all kinds of legal ways. Really, really brilliant. And it's a good example of how your single place study and single community studies shed light on broader themes. Neil Sangerbiel is another one who writes about a local history, but it's actually an event as well, which is really fascinating. So it's a localized event. So his 1937 flood journal is really great because it's not only is it microhistory and local history, but he's also done something unique in that it's a mosaic. He takes all these different, again, scattered elements, right? He's taking oral history, he's taking um, uh, written history, he's taking geography, he's taking newspaper accounts, he's taking biographies, and all these things and pulling them together to tell us something about this event from so many different perspectives. And at the same time, it's a deep history about how one event can mark your historical imagination, like your memory of something. And it's interesting because FEMA, when they go around and they do an assessment of the potential loss for a natural event of some kind, they have a category in their sort of scoring, which is community resilience, which is about how a community can rebuild, how it prepares and how it can rebuild. And he's really talking about the history of community resilience, which is so interesting. I don't know of anyone who writes this kind of thing. It's just very original. Moving on, there's a couple other people I could talk about. So Anne Fossier writes about her Acadian heritage. And Anne's approach is really, I find, so fascinating and so unique because she's coming at it from the perspective of ancestral memory. So, which I love because it fits some of the categories you talked about before, where you have people who are not who have not been written about. They are, a subject people or a people whose history was just went astray. And there's, what do we fill the gap with? We fill the gap with scattered fragments and with oral history and with this ancestral memory, because the Akkadian identity is so much it's so grounded. It comes from the deportation, the scattering of the Akkadians, which is so incredible. So it's memory. It's a community identity that comes from memory of this event. And I remember, Barbara, last week we talked about, with Diane Burley, we talked about semantic memory, which is so incredible because this is a good example of community semantic memory. And it's a really rich terrain for doing microhistory, because you can think about how does a community create its own identity through history, through their shared emotional reaction and their experience, real or imagined, about something that happened, imagined or embroidered. And the reason I'm using those words is because, being Irish, I have an understanding of my family history through the lens of Irish nationalism and Irish identity, which I know Irish people might get upset with me saying this, but a lot of it's grounded in grievance, right? And I feel like in my own history, and I've written about this, like the Irish nationalism in my family is, a lot of it's about this kind of this history, this shared communal history of oppression. And it's not necessarily the whole story, right? There was one of our writers is Lex from Next Gen Genealogy, who wrote a piece about her family who emigrated from Ireland to Australia because they fled the Irish Civil War. They were Protestant. And as it turns out, they were from the same community as my mother's family. So I had heard the story of the Irish Civil War from the Catholic version of the event. And I had no idea. It didn't occur to me until she wrote this piece how terrifying it must have been to be one of the Protestant minority in that area of Tipperary. I mean, it's just like, and so this is what I'm talking about, like this kind of semantic memory, which is so interesting and something that you can really explore in your family history, whether or not they have written records. Maybe there's nothing there, and this is the only thing you have to identify yourself, or to write your family history, or it could simply enhance your family history. The other thing that Anne does, which I think is really, really cool, is and this is on the theme of gathering up the fragments, she has this thing which she calls the slant search, which I think is the most wonderful description, which is where, there's no written record or trace left of that ancestor, but you read around and you investigate around that person in that community and try to reconstruct that person's life from what you do know about other people that she would have known, or that he would have worked alongside or lived next door to, or what have you. And I thought that's just a really great description. And that's really clearly in the groove of microhistory. That's something that you need to do for so many topics or so many subjects where there's no record. And the last person I was going to mention was Brian Demchensky, who in his book, his Substack Life Sentences, he writes a lot about his Ukrainian family. And they are just really incredible pieces, because I think he shows you how he's not necessarily doing microhistory, but what he's doing is he's taking a lot of the tools of microhistory to really enrich his family history. So he wrote a series of pieces about his Ukrainian great-grandparents arriving in Saskatchewan, emigrating to Canada in the turn of the last century. And there's one piece in particular, it's called Dominion Day, 1897, where he writes this beautiful piece about why his Ukrainian family left Ukraine, why they chose to come to Canada, what they thought they were doing by arriving in Canada, what the Canadian people were going to what the Canadian people, how they were going to understand their arrival, and then why they were able to arrive, which is, of course, that the Canadian government, before they arrived, had cleared the land of Indigenous people in Buffalo. And he pulls it all together to tell us a family story. So it's all woven into this piece. It's not just like he's not writing a history and then telling a family history. He's woven it in together so beautifully that it reverberates in this piece about his family. It's just so it makes it so rich, and you really feel the sense of place, the sense of history in his family story. So that's, I think, to my mind, that is the real. If you want to write creative nonfiction about your family, that's the most perfect example of how to use microhistory. Anyway, I'll stop there. People want to chime in and
Wow, I think
thoughts.
that's going to fire up many a comment. I will embed links to all of these publications in the notes, and I've also dropped them all into the chat as you were proceeding. I need to add you, Lori, back in. This has been fantastic. I think there will be some of you ready to go with comments. Please join in. I know you're out there, just waiting for the button. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not yet a Substacker. Lisa has been trying to encourage me. I've done family research on and off for a long time. I have one of these incredibly long pedigrees of not famous people in the United States of America, but what is always fascinating, and my family tree goes together like this, which makes it a lot easier, But I think one of the things that sort of held me back is exactly where to begin, because there is this long, and I know 10 generations of my mitochondrial DNA. I know my mother's mother's mother, which is kind of amazing. But yet I think it was Lisa in a way that inspired me, because I've also, as you can imagine, everyone has a lot of family stories. And I have one in particular that is always stuck in my mind, which is really, I think, luring me to begin it with. And it is in thinking about my own maternal grandmother, who was actually the granddaughter of my own great-grandfather, who is also my great-great-grandfather. He had 2 wives, but anyway. And it's more recent. I mean, it's recent in that something that occurred in early 1930, when my mother would have been 8 years old. I can't for the life of me remember where or when or who told me the story. It was just always there. And it was grand, a great uncle swooped up and grabbed someone from Eastern Kentucky, where my family landed after many generations and brought him to northern Wisconsin, where they all came in the 1920s, because he was falsely accused, allegedly, of murder, and he was stealing him out of jail and bringing him to my grandparents' farm, where he stayed for 3 months. And that was in my, and but then, so what I've been wrestling with was the myth and the story, because good old internet, Google. When I asked my parents about that many, many years later, they had this way of, and I'm sure you've experienced this, they say, "Oh yeah, wasn't that so and so?" And then they disappear off around the corner of the house before you can reel them in and get them to tell you exactly what's going on, what they mean. But I was able to get a couple of names, and one of them stuck out, and I was able to find something that turned out to be much more fascinating than the myth that appeals to kids. Well, my late husband always loved the myth because he thought it was good to have somebody who would take in fugitives, in the family. But in any case, that's where I've been doing research to nail down more details and try to find out who actually was the person, because I don't think it was the accused at all. I think it was one of the people that were there at the time and felt threatened. But there are a couple of names, but so. And it requires going through finding some old trial records. There was an appeal that is online that I found that had quite a lot of information. But, I think that partly is, trying to, one doesn't always necessarily want to scotch myths, but at the same time, the whole idea of placing a whole, generations of ordinary people into the history in which they lived, the time in which they lived and what was going on, I think is the most appealing thing. And for my family, it was, they landed in Virginia in the early 1600s. It took them almost 200 years to get to Eastern Kentucky. And it took them another 120 or 5 years to get to northern Wisconsin. So, and I'm sure I have, descendants of the same Martin progenitor who are scattered all over the world, because we were a pretty big family. But that whole progress, I think, is what fascinates me, because you're dealing with all of these big elements of history. And thanks to Lisa, I've been able to localize that. And the idea of focusing on a thing, an item, or a will, because, in amongst that, I have slaves in the family. And then stories that are interesting, that get misplaced and get put in a place that they don't belong. And unraveling those things, I think, are what make this whole process really fascinating and intriguing.
What I love about what you've done here, Lisa, is given us all permission to be curious. And 6 specific points we can follow, and it's just inspiring. Lisa, go ahead. Yes, hand raising is a great way to pass it down. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Lisa Oakley, and my writing coach actually recommended that I join this workshop. My background is genealogy. I'm a genealogist, and I do a lot of work for DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, to help other women become members. And I'm a registrar, so I do the applications. But as a genealogist, you become so entrenched in the real details that I never thought about being more creative. And I used to feel like I was this creative person, but I lost the creativity as a genealogist. And I decided to start writing about my family history, but as a historical fiction. But I'm so literal that I had to include I had to include the details as well. And I didn't know if I could do it. And it's been such a fun journey, because one of the things Judith and Lisa have pointed out is that through this process, I've actually learned more and more about the microhistory. And for me, it was in Washington, D.C. In 1834. And what was the city really like? It was called the City of Magnificent Distances because there were not a lot of buildings near each other. They were pretty scattered. But just in general, what I found was I've learned so much about the detail of the historical context in which our ancestors lived and why they may have made the decisions they did. And a quickie, my grandfather, who was quite a bit older than my grandmother, his father left when he was young. And I just thought of him as a scoundrel. His name was Clinton. And I was angry about it because he got some young thing pregnant, leaves his young family, for this woman and goes to Pennsylvania out of DC. And so I sort of held it against Clinton and his father because of just the way the kids grew up. They were getting caught for stealing things. Literally, I find newspaper articles. But through studying the time in which they lived, you can better understand why they made some of the decisions they did. I less blame George now. He was the immigrant from Prussia for the fact that he never paid his debts. In 1869, he owed $15,000 because he wasn't paying his debts in order to have a house, to run his bakery, but he wasn't paying the debts. He got in trouble for it. But I had greater empathy after learning about those different micro times in which he lived and the overall historical context. And it was really helpful. It made you look at things a little differently.
I love that.
Yeah, I think once you start.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. So I was saying, once you start exploring the mentality of somebody living at that time, it really enriches your own writing. I mean, it's sort of like I'm encouraging people, as I said, to flip the lens around and not think about the subject, but rather think about the broader history. But you can certainly take that broader history and then enrich your subject with it. It's really true.
It's been fascinating because it's made me do a lot more research, but in a different way, right? In the historical context of those times.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I always love a good metaphor, and flip the lens is such a simple idea of I have been narrowly focusing on this one person. And yes, Lisa, I think it's a great challenge for genealogists, specifically training yourself to stick to facts you can justify, you can prove. And yet, if you flip the lens and understand the context and then ask the why, what were the motivations? What was the human side of it? Go ahead, Judith.
I just wanted to mention something that came up. I worked on a history project that has nothing to do with my family. Took a lot of years to do, but I remember I went to a symposium at, I can't remember if it was the New York Public Library, probably it was, and there were a number of people doing in various modes of historical research, and one of them happened to have been a professor I had at CCNY, and I posed this question for all of them, and I said, to what extent do you use the fiction of the period about which you were writing? And every last one of them said, yeah, I do. And because it's so informative of, I think you get things that you can't necessarily get from the newspapers, although the newspapers of any era, I found during my research that I had to really discipline myself because your eye would stray over this way. And the next thing you know, you're reading something totally not related to the subject you are on, but at the same time, it almost always informed the subject. And I found that especially true in economics, for example.
There's a French historian named Louis Chevalier who became very enamored of this approach, this kind of what he would consider leakage from fiction, because it's never what you think it is. They're not revealing information that they think they're revealing. It's always something that they take for granted, but that we from some many decades or hundreds of years distant find really interesting. So he was looking at police procedurals written in the 19th century Paris, and what it told you about the social conditions of Paris in that period. And it was completely inadvertent. It was just stuff that he had written, that the authors had written just to have context in the story, as sort of like not even aware that they were documenting something that was of really tremendous interest to an historian many years later.
I think microhistory might be the great antidote to presentism too.
Mm,
Because the more we
mhm,
actually understand, it's real easy to look at people in the past and put our our present day on it and then not understand it. But I think the more time we spend looking at the history itself,
mhm.
the better able we are to make those judgment calls rather than do it the other way and say,
Yeah.
I'm going to make a judgment call on this based on what I know about
Mhm,
today, as opposed to what was going on then. Because that's a horrible trap to fall into when we
mhm,
start um, applying layers onto dead people and their
mhm.
stories.
And judging them. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's what we're doing is we
Mhm,
understand something in this sense,
mhm,
um, but it's not all the time accurate. The other side of that, when you talk about, using fiction as a source of as a source material for what was going on at the time, I have a hard time with that. Just because I know that a lot of the fiction that was being written across history is there may be documenting things, but it's also from a very, very specific point of view
mm,
that can be very limiting, based on who they were
mm,
and where they lived and what political message or social message they were trying to get across in their fiction. So just
mhm,
that's a little caveat about
mhm,
using fiction across any time period, as a historical sourcing.
Go
mhm.
ahead, Lisa.
I think you're on mute, Lisa. There you go.
There we go. Sorry, I thought I did, but it did something funny. Didn't want to confuse you. I've written a historical fiction, but I didn't use fiction to gather information. All of my sources are real, but for example, I never understood how, in what context my ancestor who came from Prussia married a woman who was the granddaughter of a Revolutionary War patriot and the daughter of someone who had lots of land. And, how did they even meet? Right? They were both Catholic, but that was the extent of it. And but his father was a Mason and her half brother was a Mason who was quite successful. So I was able to weave the story in that regard. But I always researched true situations, true history for everything I wrote. So, how bricks were made or what was going on during the Jacksonian period of time, who was coming in and out of DC, people like Harriet Martineau and Native Americans who were coming to DC to, you know, try to get their case heard. So it was always real types of situations, but I was weaving in the historical fiction to put it in more of a storytelling manner to make sense, but never choosing fiction as a resource.
Just to bounce off of Lori's point, many of you will know that many of the pieces that Lori writes are based on newspapers. And I think the ways in which you have specifically been diving into things like the ladies' pages is really interesting. I remember trying to find some information about my own grandmother before I hit my head on the wall and said, duh, it's not her name. Duh, it's her husband's name. So yeah, that's always fascinating.
And there's so much the untold story, right? I mean, women's business and women's pages, that was never considered mainstream history for up until very recently, right? Until the last generation of feminist historians. So there's still so much to know about that.
Exactly.
And I think it's a great place to do these microhistories that you're talking about too, Lisa, right? Because there is a little bit of information, there's a sliver of information that's out there, but then if you start digging into the details of what was really going on, you're like, I'm working on a story now about endurance walkers
Mm,
in the 1890s. It was like a huge thing. I
mm,
just finished a piece about whistling in 1894, female
mm.
whistlers. They used to have like whistling schools. in 1894. It was
Wow.
like a thing, you know. And when you start looking at what was going on at the time, that this was a time when whistling was a guy thing, and women that were doing it were either bawdy or, you know, unsocialized. And they were saying, we want to claim this. And so instead of just like whistling Yankee Doodle or something, they would whistle Bach and Beethoven, and they would give these, you know. And so when you turn it around and look at this, seems really like, when you talk about the weird, like going to
Mhm.
whistling school, really. But then you turn it around and say what was going on at the time. It's a fascinating story. And it's a lot bigger than just, you know, girls sitting on a corner whistling at each other.
Mhm. So I think like the fact that you focus a lot on like what we would consider like the human interest part of the newspaper, as I said, that's investigating the weird, right? That's where you find the treasure. Where, as you said, it just like all of a sudden it telescopes out and you see, oh my God, there's this whole current of experience that we didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see a future book that is all about the thing for each of the months of the year that just, you know, highlights it. I'm sorry, Judith, you were about to say something. Go ahead, please.
Vis-a-vis newspapers, of course, in the book project that I worked on, one of the things that I was following was, well, my book project was an equestrian history of New York City specifically. Now, it's pretty arcane, except that it wasn't, because ultimately it was an influence for the nation. But one of the discovery, of course, women were riding early on, and one of the wonderful things, the Morning Herald in the 1830s, they had an article about women, several articles actually, women, and they're almost always young women who were heiresses, because we're talking about, you know, everyone else had to work and they couldn't afford to go riding around Manhattan, which you could do completely, because Manhattan was just a little place down at the bottom. But how they referred to them, there was Miss H or Miss L, and a description of the horse that Miss H or Miss L rode. And then there were the two Miss So-and-sos who were granddaughters of one of the wealthiest men. Well, it doesn't take, somebody who's following this could probably figure out just who those granddaughters were. But as you go through from, say, the 1830s, by the time you work up to the 1860s, there's Mrs. So-and-so with a last name, Miss So-and-so with a last name. No given names involved. And you see that through the 1890s until eventually whole women's names do come into play. Not a lot, but to me, that was so fascinating, how this sort of semi-anonymity grows until there, and then by the time you get to the 20th century, everybody's name is all over the place, and these gossip columns have no compunctions about that. And vis-a-vis what Laurie was saying about following, you know, fiction, I think that the parts, I would not claim it necessarily as a resource so much as a background, and because little things come out. Like I was reading a Golden Age murder mystery by Marjorie Allingham, and it was set in the early 50s. I got more of a feeling for what the London fog was, that killer fog, reading that, you know, this crime being investigated. And it wasn't so much that it was the eerie fog, it was them having to do this incredible investigative work, and with all of this going on, where it was hard to breathe and hard to see. But, you know, so those are the little things I think about when I think of fiction informing a time period that you're writing about.
Wow. I mean, where do we get the time? This has been, go ahead.
My favorite part of seeing, when you were talking about the nomenclature of women, is when it goes from like Mrs. Howard Semrau to Mrs. Elvira Semrau.
Yeah.
And it's like all of a sudden they have a name, but they're still the Mrs., but it's not his name at all anymore. That's my favorite part.
Yeah. I think, well, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us. This is a capacity crowd. I apologize for falling off the edge of the earth for a moment there. I swear it was either my computer rebooted or a power spike. In any case, thank you for your professionalism and just continuing to go on with the story. And you can see the attachment for all of you, all of us in the audience, for what a fascinating topic this is. This will continue, guaranteed. You've inspired all of us to go around looking on our shelves for what we see in front of us and the artifacts with a whole new view, to turn the lens around and really be thinking about this larger context in a way that, is making a difference. So it's inspiring. I think all of you will join me in thanking Lisa, and join me in the comments. For those of you who aren't able to make it, feel free to add your comments and thoughts and suggested Substacks as well. Kindly no self-promotion, but you know how this is done. Just really thoughtful feedback really is what makes this community spin. And you know what? One of the reasons I do these things on Zoom is that it doesn't have to all be about Substack. Substack just creates a nice little space for us to chat with each other, and that works for me. So we're completely platform independent, and happy to use it while it works well for us. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.